And at the end of the day, block space is a competitive market. If somebody wants to be stupid, they have every right to be stupid. All it takes is a single path through the network, a single node that can accept your transaction and get it to a miner. Core developers have exactly zero ability to force anything on anybody. That is quite literally the purpose of why Bitcoin was designed this way, so that you can make the transactions that you want to make and nobody can stop you from doing that.
The Blockworks Digital Asset Summit, crypto's premier institutional event, is coming back to London this October, the 13th to the 15th. You'll hear from top names across global finance, DeFi, and policy. Think BlackRock, Circle, Coinbase, and the UK Parliament. Notable speakers already locked in include Danny Masters from CoinShares, Jeff Park from Bitwise, and plenty more to come. There's also a VIP dinner on October the 13th. That's for speakers and VIP ticket holders only. It will sell out. It's all happening at the Old Billingsgate in London. Use code SUPPLY100 at checkout for £100 off.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions the company sponsors or projects discussed. Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X, here with another great episode of Supply Shock coming at you. Not again! The Bitcoin fork drama is heating up. This time, a alternative Bitcoin client called Bitcoin Knots, garnering nearly 20% of the network amidst one of the biggest uprisings against the Bitcoin core development process in quite a number of years. The whole conversation has spilled out over social media with threats, harassment, accusations, and in some cases, outright lies. Here to break down all that's happening and give you an inside scoop on where Bitcoin development is headed and the nature of Bitcoin as a technology. We've got Bitcoin Magazine technical editor and print editor Shinobi. Welcome to the program, sir.
How's it going, Pete?
My life's a little bit less stressful than yours, I imagine. So I know you're deep in the trenches with what's going on here. Maybe you can give us the high level for full disclosure. You know, you are an opinionated participant in the current fisticuffs, as am I. But we can disclose our positions perhaps and move from there.
Kind of really hard to pick a starting point here looking at all this.
Well, it sounds like you support the most recent version of the Bitcoin core software client, right? The Bitcoin core developer in the development process, has been essentially kind of the main way Bitcoin software is released for the last 10 plus years. With few exceptions, we haven't seen many alternative implementations arise and get much market share. Of course, during the 2014 to 2017 period, there are a few notable exceptions there, but it does seem like there's broad dissatisfaction with the core development process and a lot of misinformation that is fueling that. Of course, the other side would likely mount an ideological defense, but maybe we can start with that.
I would not characterize this as like broad dissent or lack of support at all. I mean, I think the first thing to do starting this conversation is properly contextualize it. There are millions of people all over the world who own Bitcoin, who use Bitcoin in different ways. All of this drama and nonsense is effectively like the same 500 people on Twitter. To call that, broad dissent or disappointment or disagreement with what core is doing, I think is to just completely depart from reality for an alternate universe. Now, to look at the people who do have a problem with what core is doing, I think it's just a complete disconnect from how Bitcoin actually works. One of the big talking points, the things people constantly throw around is core is ramming this down their throat or forcing this change on the network. And that's just not how Bitcoin works. Core developers have exactly zero ability to force anything on anybody, unless you think that they have an army of core gremlins that are going to sneak into your house at night, open up your laptop, and just download a new version of core for you. Like you, the end user, you, the business operator who is running some business on Bitcoin, have to choose to upgrade your software. Like they cannot make you do that. And the core contention of this issue is focused on relay policy. So the filters or restrictions that nodes apply to the transactions they're passing back and forth across the network between each other, with the ultimate goal of getting them to a miner to eventually make it into a block. I think there's also there just a fundamental misunderstanding of how this works. It's really, at the end of the day, like what makes Bitcoin work as a censorship resistant system. All it takes is a single path through the network, a single node that can accept your transaction and get it to a miner to accomplish that. It's utterly irrelevant what any other node on the network is doing, as long as that node, that path to a miner exists that will accept your transaction. And no amount of software changes, of extra restrictive filters that you apply on your node will stop somebody else from finding that node, giving them their transaction, and ultimately getting it to a miner. So what people are kind of expecting or demanding core developers do, which is essentially ship software that prevents that from happening, is something that is literally impossible for them to do. Like anybody can just go on GitHub, download the source code, alter whatever policy they wish to implement in the node however they want, and compile it and run it. There's absolutely nothing core developers can do to stop people from doing that. And once that handful of people who choose to do that do so, and those nodes are up and running on the network, whatever transaction they choose to relay, it will be relayed. And any miner who wishes to accept it and include it in a block will do so. There is nothing core developers can do to stop that. And I think there's just a complete failure to appreciate that amongst all of these people.
Well, I think maybe, we've had some of those, the people from that camp on. We had Chris Guida early on in the podcast, maybe a few months ago, back when there was a little bit less drama around the whole thing. So maybe to start with, would you describe that ability for anyone to get any transaction, even if it's sort of on the edges of validity, into the network as an essential property, right? Is that essentially, something that is desirable for Bitcoin to have? Is anyone to sort of, push the limits of the network and essentially get it, confirmed and have their transaction relayed?
Yes. I mean, that is quite literally the purpose of why Bitcoin was designed this way, so that you can make the transactions that you want to make and nobody can stop you from doing that. That is literally its purpose for existing.
Well, I mean, there are people on the network who are engaged in some behavior that you would say is antithetical to that, even outside this current camp, right? So there are people who are running chain analysis software on Bitcoin transactions. They're using that, to confirm or deny what service they provide to Bitcoin users. How different is that than, some node operators essentially saying, for whatever philosophical, political reasons, I don't want to relay these transactions. How is that a different scenario in your opinion than businesses not seeking to serve certain types of transactions in certain ways?
Well, I mean, it's the difference of scope. Like one is a merchant, like essentially telling you that I'm not going to sell you something. That in no way gives that merchant the ability to stop any other merchant from selling you something if they so choose. Like you still have the ability to go somewhere else, to spend your money somewhere else. And one person refusing to interact with you does nothing to prevent that. Philosophically, the equivalent of this happening, trying to filter transactions on the network itself, is more akin to somebody essentially trying to take your money as a merchant and go, I'm not going to allow you to spend this anymore. As we just kind of covered, it's not practically possible for that to be accomplished. No matter how many people try to do this, it will not work. But still, from a philosophical point of view, that's what they're attempting to do.
Well, maybe to draw the technical distinction, so Bitcoin Core moving towards a framework where essentially whatever is being relayed to miners, there's an expansion or loosening of the policy for the kind of node relay network to include some of these non-standard transactions that have been getting mined. It sounds like the argument from the core developers is essentially, this leads to better decentralization. It leads to more competition, more miners being able to contribute for some sort of these high fee transactions in blocks. That's essentially, their argument. On the not side, there's an interest in, essentially discouraging and stopping these transactions, whether at the kind of node level or the miner level. And they're, really, it sounds like hoping for either a status quo, just for things not to be a loosening of this policy, or even something more restrictive. Is that a fair definition, you would say, of the state of play?
Yeah, I mean, if you really look at things, you have the consensus rules. So what is allowed at the consensus level in a block? Like what transactions you can include in a block and have that block still be consensus valid, still have it accepted as a valid block by nodes across the network. And then you have the relay rules, which are applied to the individual transactions being passed around the network, ultimately, in search of a miner to mine them. And traditionally, there has been a lot more restrictive checks on the relay level versus the consensus level. And some of those things are for very logical reasons, like they're replaced by fee. Like that requires, if you broadcast a transaction spending a specific UTXO, in order to broadcast a conflicting transaction, nodes will not accept and relay that's conflicting transaction unless it pays a higher fee. And the reason that that is done is so that somebody can't just take a single coin and create like thousands and thousands of transactions spending it in a different way and just flood the entire network with it, like waste bandwidth, potentially even crash nodes offline. And so that rule requires the fee increase for each new or variation of that transaction, so that each time
also very
does that,
worth noting, a controversial change at the time when it was made.
yes, it was, but it's there is a logic there. And the reason that was done was because prior to that, there was essentially a rule called first seen safe, and a node would see a transaction spending an individual coin, and it would refuse to accept or relay any different version of that transaction, like whichever one it saw first.
Yeah, which led to stuck transactions and people just sort of having, transactions, just never failing or never confirming.
Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, it's in miners' best interest to, regardless of that, accept a version of a transaction if it pays a higher fee. And we started seeing signs of people working around, miners accepting these transactions out of band from the relay network. And it just became, very obvious that if miners have a monetary incentive to accept that new version of a transaction because they earn more money from that than the original, they're going to do so. So there's no real reason to keep that rule in place, that first seen safe, because miners are going to ignore it and find ways around it. If users want to make those transactions, they're going to find a way to get it to miners anyway. And ultimately, what it comes down to is the incentive alignment there. If a user wants to pay for something and a miner will accept it if there's no extenuating circumstances to disincentivize them from including it. For instance, there are transactions that you can craft that would take hours for a consumer desktop to verify a block if you just created a large amount of these transactions and filled an entire block with them. Miners have an incentive not to do that because that actually causes harm to the network. But in the absence of those kind of disincentives, like if the user and miners incentives align, it's going to happen anyway. And it's, the exact same situation we're going through now with these so-called spam transactions. Like some users of the network don't like the fact that people are essentially using a Bitcoin transaction to store JPEGs or other arbitrary data on the blockchain. I don't really like it either. I think it's...
Well, you did publish one of your most recent articles in a Bitcoin transaction, right?
Yes, I did that to prove the point, though, that you can't stop this, even like regardless of whether you want to or you like it or not. You know, I personally think these things are stupid. They're a waste of money, but that's not my money. And if somebody wants to use their Bitcoin to do these things, pay the fee. If the transaction is consensus valid, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's their business.
Don't you feel like there's a bit of a referendum at play, though? Because, at the end of the fork wars, there was this idea that Bitcoin, was going to be a settlement network, and that there were going to be sort of, different types of fee-paying transactions with different data types, up to including layer twos and different things like that, needing extra data to kind of post on the blockchain. And it does feel like now there's like kind of a complete referendum on that idea just generally. It seems like there are some kind of in the Knots camp who don't even want to make any concessions to layer twos at this point. They're really just sort of want to view Bitcoin as it currently is as sort of a finished model. And so I don't know, it's interesting to me because it picks at the different dynamics, right? If you kind of think about where we ended with the fork wars, there was kind of two sides, one where the users and the nodes really kind of emerged, politically triumphant, feeling like they were able to kind of steer the miners and the businesses towards a certain technical outcome. Here we're seeing that same sort of effort being employed. Would you agree?
It's just like, again, it just keeps coming back to not thinking rationally on that side of the camp. Ultimately, at the end of the day, a transaction that's trying to store a JPEG on chain is not going to be as economically competitive as a normal financial transaction. Like when you transact on Bitcoin, you're not dealing with something that works like the legacy financial system. Like the fee you pay has no relationship to the amount of value you're transferring. It's not like a credit card system where you pay X percent of the amount of the transaction. You are paying for the amount of data space that you are taking up in a block. And at the end of the day, financial transactions are very small. Like your average Bitcoin transaction that somebody's going to make is usually on the order of like 150 to 200 and something.
Right, but I think my point was that whole system of thought, sort of accommodated there being something that wasn't a financial transaction, or that was a financial transaction plus some sort of data. And it seems now, amongst the Knots camp, there's sort of a total disavowal of that, system. If you think about, World War II ended, with a consensus, right?
I'm trying to kind of like round the bend and get back to that, but like it's the JPEG though, like that's going to be kilobytes, like megabytes, some of them. At the end of the day, block space is a competitive market. When it comes down to it and demand for that market is saturated, your financial transaction in absolute monetary terms is going to be able to pay less, but still outbid it in like a JPEG in relative data terms or like fee rate terms. And that should push the JPEG out and confirm first. Like it's a competitive thing.
We saw that when fees spiked in 2024, I would argue,
But like they don't want to accept that this is a problem that will solve itself. And so like when you kind of pivot back around to getting upset about arbitrary data that is involved in financial transactions or layer twos that process financial transactions, there's no logical or rational basis for being against that. Ostensibly, coming from their position, their argument is Bitcoin is for financial transactions and not storing JPEGs. It's simply an irrational fixation on this data that is not in and of itself strictly a financial transaction, regardless of its involvement or its necessity to facilitate them. And that's bad because they have decided that arbitrary data is bad, irregardless of the whole point of Bitcoin being, I should be able to transact without somebody being able to stop me. And it's just completely jumped the shark. Like there is no logically consistent, worldview or framework on that side of the fence at this point. It's just reactive lashing out at individual examples in no comprehensive way.
Well, I think, if I was to, again, I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the arguments on that side, but, if I was to take the most charitable, let's discard kind of the, claims of, political subversion or pornography and sort of, get to what their point is. It sounds like they want the Bitcoin core developers to encourage a certain set of behaviors, and they are sort of unwilling to accept the technical argument, however sound it is, and however many contributors within the Bitcoin core process have, agreed that this is the most sound technical analysis of the situation. They seem unwilling to accept that, and they want sort of, the Bitcoin core developers to be signaling that certain activity is, preferred on the network.
I mean, no core developer that I know wants these types of transactions. Nobody does on our side of the fence.
Don't you feel like that's a little bit untrue though?
Yeah, but not amongst the core developers, the people actually working on that software project, maintaining things, or involved in pushing this, coming change in the next release. All of them don't like these types of transactions. They don't like the fact that people are using Bitcoin in this way, but they acknowledge the technological reality that there is no way to stop them from doing so under the current consensus rules. And, in the face of that reality, the actions they're taking are simply aimed at mitigating the second order effects and harm that can be caused by trying to fight this thing that you'll never be able to stop with a tool relay policy. It's at the end of the day, like I said, if a miner wants to accept this transaction and mine it, and users willing to pay for it, somehow that's going to happen. Trying to kind of force people to not use the public relay network pushes them into private arrangements or private channels for the user to get that transaction to a miner. And in doing so, you're essentially closing off that potential fee revenue from other miners. And that's a very bad thing if you actually care about mining decentralization, because you want any miner who connects to the network anywhere to be able to access and collect whatever transactions out there are paying fees, regardless of what they are, so that they can maximize their revenue. And when you create this situation where you try to close off the public relay network as a way for miners to access that transaction, push users to go directly to miners, they're going to go to the biggest miners. They're the ones with the most resources that they can put towards, facilitating transactions out of that like this. They're the ones with the most hash rate, so the most likelihood to mine it quickly, and reliably.
Well, that's I think this argument has been technically vetted, right? And the Bitcoin core community is standing behind it, right? But there's this idea, I think, amongst the Knots people that they can dissent anyway, right? Even if it's not something, even again, if something's 100% correct, there's no use kind of making these arguments endlessly. The reality is that they are seeking tools right now to not go along with this change for whatever reason, right? And then maybe they won't be convinced, ever, and maybe that's their right to. I always say that one of the beautiful things about America is that you don't have to vote, you don't have to participate in democracy, if you don't want to, and then it seems like these node runners are seeking to be part of the network, but they are abdicating some of, or they want to dissent, right? They want to follow their own set of standards. So what's wrong with that?
I mean, at the end of the day, that is their right. If somebody wants to be stupid, they have every right to be stupid. No one can force them not to be. But that doesn't change the fact that they are accomplishing nothing that they are setting out to accomplish. All they are doing is creating the more people that dissent and run knots, the more degradation they are creating for the overall network in terms of being that free access place where any miner can find the highest paying transactions to maximize their revenue. They're degrading the speed at which blocks propagate across the network, so that when a new block is found, miners can see it as quickly as possible and stop wasting their time mining a block that will be orphaned and evicted from the blockchain because one's already been found, and miners who've seen that already are already on to the next one, and just harming themselves. Like, they have zero chance of accomplishing the goal that they set out to accomplish. At the end of the day, it's essentially a bunch of children virtue signaling and smashing their plate on the table because they don't want to eat what mom and dad made for dinner. It's not going to accomplish it.
Right. I think Greg Maxwell and other long tenured Bitcoin developers have made essentially the argument that they're arguing for authority in a system without authority. And, for whatever reason, the calls for the Bitcoin core developers to change and the accusations against them, don't seem to be stopping. I think we're on month 3 or 4 of this being, essentially a continued call to action where, certain developers are being, attacked and threatened online. And some of the argumentation now has, in the words of Adam Back, calling on the 4 horsemen of,
Infopocalypse.
Pornography. This will enable pornography. This will enable degeneracy. This will enable, all sorts of, kind of negative things, and therefore we must stop it. So where do you think that's coming from? I know you've been on the receiving end of some of that. Maybe dished it out a little bit in smaller doses.
Oh no, the only comment I have made on that topic directed at anyone else was the comment that historically people who tend to make those accusations of others very frequently wind up being found guilty of that thing themselves. But and I will say that was just a kind of a flippant remark, but it's really just insane. Like, they have no rational argument. Like, as much as they wish to deny it, every argument that has been put forward from that camp has been systematically, logically dismantled. Not only with pure logical argumentation, but in most of the cases with actual empirical evidence that the opposite of what they are claiming is what's actually happening in the real world on the network today. And
this is where I feel like a lot of the original defense of ordinals and these different types of protocols has kind of fallen by the wayside. Where it's I think if you were to kind of be very charitable about this wave of protocols that kind of enabled this activity, they were essentially initially justified as well, this is how Bitcoin is supposed to work, and we're actually training people to understand how abstractly how Bitcoin will work as a settlement layer. When there's many types of layers on Bitcoin and a vibrant fee market. And a lot of that has fallen away. I'm kind of curious why that has become so absent from the conversation, because, at least early on when, Casey Rodemer was making the defense of ordinals and kind of talking about how it functioned, there was a sense that it was, as I said, following even though it wasn't, in the spirit of the protocol, right? You can argue that, he's putting something that shouldn't be on Bitcoin. A lot of the initial argumentation was that it was essentially following the rule structure, right? That even though the transactions were essentially different, they were essentially modeling certain behavior that, developers expected to see on the network. And that argumentation has really, I think, fallen away almost completely.
Well, first of all, I would say Ordinals doesn't need a defense. It is possible in the consensus rules. People want to do it, so they're going to do it. But that facet of the arguments kind of fell to the wayside just because the fee pressures came down. Like, that initial frenzy of the NFTs using ordinals and inscriptions, and the other token protocols like BRC20, like, it faded away, which is exactly what most of us were telling them from the very beginning. Like, these types of fads, like, they're not new in this space. They're not even new in Bitcoin. Like, most people in this space today probably don't know this because they haven't been around that long. But NFTs were originally created on Bitcoin. The first NFTs were on the Bitcoin blockchain, and they
Stable coins as well, and
but they migrated to these other chains because developers building these things just wanted to experiment with the capabilities that other chains offered. And at the end of the day, it's kind of migrated back here. But these things have always, been cyclical hype cycles. No NFT or token protocol on any chain has ever sustained consistent, never ending use except stablecoins. Like everything else, it follows the same predictable hype cycle, massive price appreciation and crashes. And then the interest peters out until some project or influx of new people or whatever,
Right, but that's what I mean. If it's if I describe sort of the Nolan Bowerly, our good friend, likes to call the the World War II consensus of the world, right? So the World War II ends, you have these nations get together and they sort of set the terms of Bretton Woods, right? And they say this is how the world is going to be. The U.S. is going to run the monetary system, and you're all going to save your debt and in U.S. Treasury bonds. The end of the World War, the Fork War consensus. So what was the Fork War consensus? If I were to describe it, it was essentially this idea that it rested on a few principles. One, that nodes were kind of the defining arbiters of network activity, and were sort of the primary stakeholders, against the miners and the businesses, but they were the primary kind of user group. The other one, I think, was that this idea that Bitcoin would be a settlement layer. It would have layers, right? It would scale in layers. The alternative to having larger blocks was to scale in layers. And it would have multiple types of kind of top level protocols that allowed for all these kind of experimentation that you're talking about, stable coins, NFTs, the like, and then condense that into the Bitcoin blockchain such that there was a fee market. Because this was thought as a way to preserve Bitcoin in the long term through a fee market, right? People forget the big blockers, were sort of vilified for not wanting a fee market. They wanted Bitcoin to be cheap. And it does seem like, for grading sort of the Knots group against this consensus, they, very quietly have a referendum against it, right? So if you look at, the big blockers sort of wanted transactions to be cheap. Well, the Knots camp seems to largely want that same thing as well. Bitcoin scaling in layers, that was sort of emergent from the Fork War consensus. There is hostility to even this idea that Citria and other layer 2 protocols within Bitcoin would make use of data inputs, so that seems to be thrown out as well. And then the node primacy, right? This idea that businesses and miners are somehow subservient to the nodes, because the nodes enforce the rules. They seem to be really stuck on this one, right? This seems to be like kind of their big thing, right? It's that if they can get enough nodes and they can get enough consensus, then they can recapture the magic of the fork wars and change Bitcoin. So I don't know. What do you think about this fork war consensus, and do you agree with the analysis? And what do you think? What do you think is driving that? Because it does seem like it's a referendum on this era.
Well, I definitely think your summary of like where consensus seemed to be at the end of the war,
Oddly, by some of the same participants who were in that consensus, which is the part that's so strange about it. You're seeing like Beauty On and Luke Dash Jr., like people who I would have described as like primary contributors to that consensus, sort of seem to now be solely fixated on node privacy as like the sort of absolute tenets of the network. But here I don't really see how it works out. That the nodes can really be ignorant of economic activity, or and can have some sort of final say over economic activity, because I don't know. I don't know how you make that argument. I fall short.
Well, it's as far as the node supremacy aspect, I mean, they're not wrong, but they miss like the core of that dynamic, which is miners and businesses are subservient to nodes that have economic relevance or generate economic activity. Like if you are not actually using that node, if you're not running a business or selling services, receiving transactions regularly, or not regularly generating activity, transacting yourself, like your node doesn't matter. Like just spinning up thousands of nodes on the network that you never use that don't actually correlate to an economic actor using Bitcoin for economic activity is irrelevant.
But the argument of the big blockers was that the USAF ASF nodes at the time were economically relevant, right? That was sort of their stock line.
Well, I mean, the UASF was as much a game of chicken as any.
Well, how would you describe the point at which the UASF became economically relevant? I would struggle to define the point where that seems objectively true, that you could make the assertion that the UASF was economically relevant.
It was always relevant. It was just to what degree. And when did it become relevant enough that it caused the other side to blink? It's kind of hard to put a finger on an exact point, but I would definitely say around the time, or maybe specifically when Bitfinex launched their fork futures markets, and when people could actually see that compared to the amount of people on the big block side, small blockers were way more willing to put their money where their mouth was.
Right. That's interesting. That's an interesting thesis there. There's a lot of debate, of course, about how widespread these things are. I think an equal opposite thesis is simply that, the big blocker side, which was Bitcoin maximalist sort of heading into 2017, by the middle of 2017, had largely capitulated and moved a lot of their economic activity over to Ethereum out of pressure from their venture investors. So it's sort of a two-sided. It's hard to figure out what would have happened had that side dug in and had the incentives to dug in. Though obviously that didn't happen, but yeah, it's interesting to see where it goes. I don't know. I feel like, I think I said this to you at the beginning of, this drama, where I said, the bear case for, this whole drama that was about to unfold was, you centrally had an effort to make a UASF style sort of, people's revolution within Bitcoin that sort of failed against the economic relevance of these actors. And then, really what you have shatter is the myth, in the same way we're passing out of World War II consensus, maybe on a macro level, we're sort of passing out of the fork war consensus here, because essentially that side is showing the limitations of these possibilities, or essentially, maybe there is a limit to what nodes can do to force activity on the network. Though, I mean, look, there's a lot of effort. There's funding into an alternative development implementation. Maybe there is maybe that does formalize into something. And look, I mean,
actually, before we go too far, I want to kind of come back to the aspect of the not supporters, being very fixated on this idea of keeping fees cheap for users. You had Chris Guida a few months ago, and he in particular, when challenged on that issue of fees going up for users, I put to him the question a few times, what is the difference between JPEG or spam transactions driving fees up and pricing out users with less Bitcoin and unable to pay those high fees, and simply too many financial transactions doing that? And he would consistently answer that it was unacceptable if JPEGs or spam was the cause of driving up fees and pricing.
Yeah, it ended up being a class war. And I mean, I think
but hold on, but it was totally fine if it was other economic transactions. And that's just completely illogical and irrational to me. The net effect is the exact same thing. It's less value users.
It's an inputs versus outputs thing, right? So the output is the same, and so therefore it doesn't really matter if the input is different. I think you could actually argue that the entire Ordinals conversation is actually an inputs versus outputs argument, and it's sort of the original kind of Casey Rortimore vision is the input to Ordinals is bad crypto stuff, but the output is a modeling of how things should have worked according to the post fork war consensus. And again, the developers, I think, have largely been, it's been unclear why the demand for Bitcoin hasn't materialized in the same way that we thought it would in the fork wars. And you can see that evidence in a number of ways, right? We have the Lightning Network, and we obviously built this thing because we thought there would be so many fees on Bitcoin that we would need to use it. And so that's why I said I think a lot of it comes from the fracturing of this kind of fork war consensus. And I actually do think the Ordinals people or the builders have largely aligned with, where the, fork war consensus was. And I do see the Knots, camp as being outside of that. I don't think that necessarily disqualifies their opinions, right? I don't know if it's enough to say that, like, okay, they're against this prior consensus, therefore, like, their opinions are incorrect. It's just that, like, we open up, a can of worms where now it's like there were reasons that decisions were made, within earlier times of Bitcoin's history, and now we're having a referendum on those ideas in the present, and so we're sort of actually litigating the past, as well. And yeah, I don't know. It's hard to know, right? Because I mean, I've also made passionate arguments for the right to dissent on Bitcoin. I think that's one of the things that separates Bitcoin from other cryptocurrency protocols. And so, to the extent that Knots people, want to dissent and make their own implementation, I actually think I broadly encourage that. I don't really understand then, though, where their animosity comes from for the core developers and the development process. That becomes the confusing part, because they do seem like the primary drivers of the animosity to the core developers and their particular moralizing of the core developer actions. That seems to be like problematic. If I was to delineate something that I think is problematic, I don't necessarily think it's wrong that they're building this implementation. I actually think you could argue that that's good, and some have. I wouldn't go as far to run it myself, but you could argue that the emergence of it is good, but then they have this sort of moral antagonism against the other people in the system, and I think that's the thing that's kind of the biggest turnoff to the Knots group.
Yeah, and that is my problem with all of this. Like, I think, like we've gone through, like, this is accomplishing nothing. Like, their end goal will not be achieved through the course of action they're taking. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a decentralized, self-sovereign system, and they have every right to run whatever software they choose to. Like, that's their choice. That is
even their
choice.
idea that, like, the developers, their assertion the developers have broken their trust with the community. Well, it's like we weren't supposed to trust the developers to begin with. So there isn't a covenant here that was broken, because no such covenant exists, between the users and developers. So I don't know. It's hard to. I think this is what Greg Maxwell got when he, was talking with Bitcoin Mechanic and really got to the core of it, which is like, it's like, what do you want? It's like, what is the world that you're arguing for? And it seems like it's a world where you're arguing for the developers to be, some sort of standard setters for behavior, or some sort of moral police for behavior, or at least you're arguing that, people broadly have a responsibility towards, I actually could even get behind that argument. I could even get behind the argument that people have a responsibility to act, congenially on a network. But you could argue that, like, within the social sphere, they're, the people who run Knots largely have abdicated that. They're not, if on the network, like the Ordinals and Season 2 crowd is, being antagonistic, they are doing that in the social sphere, probably equally, if not more so.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's a responsibility at all. Like, this is an adversarial, decentralized system, and it needs to be designed to be robust against, malicious or disruptive actors. I mean, it would be nice if people weren't disruptive or malicious, but in no way is that a responsibility in my mind.
Yeah, it's a lack of participation in the technical conversation, right? That's the thing that I think that, like, with Mechanic and Luke, it's like you can see that they're deliberately going outside of the technical conversation, like appealing to the users via, this endless video series where they're, kind of wringing their hands. And look, I like both of those guys, personally. And again, I think a lot of their, ideas, like, on their own, if they were building something that they thought was useful, and, Godspeed if they put a foundation around Knots and they want to keep developing it. Again, I think, dissent in the Bitcoin system can be a beautiful thing. I don't really understand, though, why it has come out with the animosity, and I don't really understand what can be achieved through that, because I think the more people dig in and the more, public displays of anger about it that you have, I think the more you're going to increase the capacity for a fork. And I think the Knots folks are the most likely, to fork of the two groups. That seems pretty obvious.
Well, I mean, I think the animosity, it's them telling on themselves, and it shows that this really isn't about them having the freedom to do what they want.
It's ironic because there's a Beauty on thread from yesterday that was the exact inverse of this argument.
But it is like, it's ultimately that this is not about them wanting the freedom to do what they want. They have that. They have always had that. It is impossible for them to not have that, given Bitcoin's nature as a voluntary opt-in system. What they want is to control other people. They want to restrict what other people are doing or make other people do what they want to do themselves. And that frustration is boiling over. And you can see that in the constant escalation of the animosity. Like the more like they're confronted with the reality that they do not have a mechanism to make other people act in the way they want, the more unhinged and the more animist they become. And it's been the consistent pattern for the last 2 years.
Though they might, right? I mean, given a long enough timeline, I mean, it's hypothetically possible, I guess, that they can invent such a thing or achieve such a thing. Though I struggle to figure out exactly how they would achieve that. But prior to Ordinals, I would have said that would have been hard to imagine any of this happening to begin with. So yeah, I don't know. I just think it's ultimately like my referendum on the Knots people has always been that I think they come from like a fundamentally like weak worldview about Bitcoin. They ultimately think that Bitcoin is fragile and sort of needs protection from sort of moral or idealistic users. And I think that I don't think that argument will pass muster at a time where Bitcoin is becoming more mainstream and people are becoming far less ideological about it, and that has to be the direction that Bitcoin, sort of goes. I understand why people, like the sort of Knots evangelism, and I think the, feel good, conservatism of it, nobody likes that they're putting up condos like in your hometown, like where your dad owned the farm, but that's how it goes, right? Yeah, hard to say where we go from here. I don't know. Again, I just see both people getting more and more dug in, and I think eventually it'll come to a head in some level.
I mean, I think it essentially has, with like the kind of trying out child sexual assault material as an argument, and kind of just freely, with like no abandon, throwing that at everyone, anyone. Like it's like that's it.
It's
Like
not even
they're
a technically viable argument because there's nothing that's actually changed about how Bitcoin could or could not accommodate such material as a result of this new core implementation.
exactly.
And the idea that that you on the network have some sort of culpability to follow some sort of moral or extra legal standard in how you participate in the Bitcoin network should just be on its face just an obviously problematic worldview that, just seems like you shouldn't condone, like no one should condone that. I think Trey Walsh had like a response that was like pretty similar to that, which is like just the idea that like we would be creating a worldview for Bitcoin where you as the runners of a permissionless software, have some moral or personal responsibility like about what happens. And I get that. I've listened to Bitcoin Mechanics, long speech about how he's okay relaying financial transactions for bad things, but he stops at arbitrary data for bad things. But I don't really understand the distinction personally. I don't think it's a strong argument.
Like it's just a pure drive of emotional rhetoric at this point. Like they have no logical argument to stand on. They have no consistency amongst the series of different arguments they've progressed through over the last 2 years. And it's just boiled down to a pure emotional appeal. Here is this heinous, sick, disgusting thing that no one in their right mind could ever support or justify. So we will just attempt to associate that with everyone on the other side and use that as a rhetorical device to try to defeat their actually, logically sound argument. And as far as I'm concerned, like that's dumb. Like that's you've effectively gone. We give up. We lose the argument. Like when you resort to tactics like that.
Shinobi, technical editor, Bitcoin Magazine. How are you covering the story from here? How are you dedicating your editorial resources, your vast editorial resources?
I'm just focusing, and have been the last couple months, on kind of going back to the basics. Like I feel like this whole saga has kind of shown that the last, I guess, generation or two of Bitcoiners just did not have the type of basic educational information that you or I or other earlier people in the space have access to. Like there's just not that comprehensive basic understanding of how all of this works that everyone we know and like came through the space together with, acquired over the years. And so I've kind of stepped back a little bit, and I'm focusing a lot less on the cutting edge of things, where's like the bleeding boundaries of people pushing on the edge of what's possible or understandable. And just going back to the basics, because that is a big hole that needs to be filled. Like if you want the kind of dialogue and discourse in the space to be rational and founded in logic, like people have to have that rational, logical understanding of things. And somebody has to do it. So I'm kind of going back and trying to fill in those gaps for people and make that understanding as accessible as possible.
Well, you've got me thinking the fracturing of the four-core consensus. Maybe I have to put pen to paper on that one. But Shinobi, appreciate you coming online. Bitcoinmagazine.com/print. You can check out the print magazine newest edition on newsstands now. The Lightning issue, some great work as always with the Bitcoin Magazine team. Over to the Blockworks, you can join us out in London this October Digital Asset Summit. I'll be bringing a Bitcoin perspective. We'll see if the Bitcoin core versus nots argument extends as far as the boundaries of London, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of debate around Bitcoin treasury companies, digital asset treasury companies, and of course, Bitcoin and crypto, Bitcoin versus crypto, the age-old debate. Go to blockworks.co/events. Find out more, get your tickets. For now, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.